So I'd like today to be as informal as it can be, so please feel free to jump in if you want to. If you have questions or if you have issues you want to bring up, as long as they're relevant to the whole group, that's cool. I encourage a little anarchy, so feel free to jump in. I'm going to read something to you from a book that I read. It wasn't the best book in the world, but I thought that the beginning of it, or what it talked about in terms of PTSD was terrific. So I want to read you this quote. Aunt Helen had to work after my Uncle Richard came back from World War II. She said he looked just as handsome as when he left, but his mind was still at war. He screamed at night. He couldn't sleep. Sometimes he cried. We'd be eating supper together when Uncle Richard would go out on the porch alone. He'd say, "Won't you all excuse me?" Uncle Richard always carried a book with him wherever he went. He said it was the best drug he had to ease the pain. Nobody would have ever guessed that he was so banged up inside. I suppose that's the way it was with everyone, really. That line between what's inside and what's outside. In 1998, I was asked to work on a murder trial. The man who was accused of the murder was named Richard Keach. Richard was 77 years old at the time, and he was accused of murdering his daughter's perpetrator, the man who had battered her. Richard was a World War II vet. He had been in a Japanese prisoner of war camp for over 4 years. He had watched beheadings. He had seen people tortured. He himself had been tortured. So when he came to trial, there were two issues that they wanted to look at. The first one was, how do we look at domestic violence that isn't physical? Because what happened in that case was what's called vicarious trauma, was secondary domestic violence. And the second thing was PTSD. Well, PTSD became the primary defense. That was the primary defense. Domestic violence became the secondary defense. What we looked at were things like threats by the perpetrator. We looked at things, misuse of the child, stalking behavior, attacks on the family, physical intimidation. He was a rugby player. The jury understood that. They got it. Unfortunately, it was the secondary defense. What the jury didn't understand was how someone could be affected by PTSD 50 years later. He was found guilty of first-degree murder when he was 78 years old, and he was sent to Pelican Bay. I don't know how many of you know Pelican Bay, but it's the prison for the worst offenders in California. And it was as far away from his family just about as he could have gotten. Eventually, Mr. Keach was given a compassion removal, and he was moved back to LA County, and then he was dying of cancer, and they gave him a compassionate release. But the case was so compelling to me. The fact that people could not understand what happened and that someone could be affected by things that had happened to them so long ago. Because isn't that who we're working with? People who have had things happen to them a very long time ago and are playing them out as they get older. They called it shell shock during World War I. During World War II, oh, is it not on at all?
Well, it's down near your...
Oh, it's off.
Nether regions.
Oh, I'm carrying it on my groin. I think if I could throw my voice, it would work, but...
Is that better? Better? Okay.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. Could you hear me before without it? Yeah, probably not. Okay. During the Vietnam War, I was working at the VA hospital in Long Beach, and we had young men returning from Vietnam and from combat, and they came back and they were diagnosed with PTSD. But at that time, PTSD was really considered a problem that they had psychologically. It was an individual issue. It was not seen in a broader perspective. It was seen as something that these flawed individuals had, but it wasn't seen so very universally. One of the things that was real interesting to me was a recent piece of research, and if I could give you the quote and know who did it, I would. All I remember is the research. But there was recent research on veterans returning from the Middle East, and it was looking at, the speculation was that these veterans that had PTSD were people who were a little psychologically unstable before they went into combat, and they were affected more globally when they returned from combat. So what they found was in this group of a little less than 100 people that only 3 of the folks that returned, 3 of the combat vets, only 3 of them did not have symptoms of PTSD. What is your analysis of this work? Anybody have any ideas about this?
Going to war is traumatic.
Yeah, going to war is traumatic. Okay. Should be basically how we start, right? Going to war is traumatic. Why do you think 3 people showed no symptoms of PTSD?
You have no capacity.
Bingo. The 3 people that had no symptoms of PTSD were sociopaths. They had no conscience. They were not affected by the same things. So what we're looking at is something that really isn't a disorder, but it's a normal response to an abnormal situation. There was a young man who entered my group. He had just come back from Iraq. And when he left for Iraq, he had a girlfriend. He was a trusting young man. He was not a jealous young man. When he returned from Iraq, he had seen people get, Dear Joan and Dear John letters. He had been in combat. He returned a very different young man. And in fact, the reason he came into a domestic violence group was because he was at a bar with his girlfriend, and he had gone out for something, and when he came back, she was talking to another man, and she was laughing. And he slapped her in the bar. And he was arrested, and he hit her pretty hard. I interview, which is my practice, I try to interview both people. If there's not a protective order, even if there is a protective order, and I can get the information on where the person is, I can do a phone intake with the victim because you get a better perspective on what's going on. But if there isn't, then I try to do an in-person interview. I interviewed both him and his girlfriend. They both said the same thing. Before he went to Iraq, he thought before he acted. When he returned from Iraq, he acted before he thought. That makes perfect sense because training in the military, right, involves pattern and repetitive learning that becomes reflexive. It becomes something you can do without thinking a whole lot. It is critical for survival that you are able to think that quickly and react that quickly. But what happens when these folks come home and they now have to deal with their families? They now have to deal with their kids. They have to deal with their relationships. They might have to deal with irritating citizens that the rest of us have to deal with. People on the road, right? People in the grocery store. People who we wonder about. But when they come back, it's like maybe wondering, who do I trust? Who would understand what I've been through? And who can I tell about it who's really got my back? And what you know is that pretty much your buddies have your back. Now, in this country, prior to the war situations, most of the people who were diagnosed with PTSD were victims, adult and child victims, of domestic violence and sexual assault. That's who we overwhelmingly saw as the victims. Now, think about being a child. Think about your own childhood. How many of you have very clear and very many memories of your life prior to the age of 6? 1, 2. You have a lot of memories and very explicit memories prior to the age of 6. Okay. Okay, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Most people have body memory more than they have cognition prior to the age of 6. Because you don't have the life experience prior to the age of 6, you don't have the vocabulary to define what's happening to you, and you don't have the ability to explain to someone else what has happened to you. But our brains develop most exponentially between birth and 6 years old. So think about all the learning that we have at that period of time. Now imagine that learning takes place in a state of hyperarousal and emotional numbing, which is what happens to children who are abused. It also happens to our veterans. They get a lot of learning in a state of hyperarousal and emotional numbing. What we know is that, and Bob's going to talk about this a lot more, but is that those memories are really sealed in the brain in a whole different way. Children are left with feelings about what's happened to them in general. And those feelings manifest in adult relationships. Imagine what happens when these children enlist in the military and are deployed. Trauma on trauma, right? Now, there are commonalities between veterans' PTSD and the kind of PTSD that we see in adults who are abused and children. The first thing is the perception of unrealistic threats. The perception, so you see threat around you in places that people who have not been abused and have not been in combat do not see in the same way. I was walking in a shopping center one day, and I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention. It was broad daylight. I was just walking down, and I hear this sound behind me, but I'm not paying a whole lot of attention. And all of a sudden, these big arms close around me, and this guy picks me up off the ground. And I turn around, and it's my son's friend from junior high, Howard. And Howard was raised in a very violent area of Long Beach and became a gang member. And he said to me, Alyce, you have to pay attention. You never know who's going to come up behind you. You have to be alert about what's going to happen to you. And I said, Howard, that's your life. That's not my life. That's his life. That's his experience. It becomes ingrained in who you are to be seeing threat and being hypervigilant about threat. The other thing is hostile appraisal of events. So we see that a lot with the men in our programs and the female perpetrators in our programs. What we see is that they will look at their partners, right? And they will interpret the way their partners treat them from a negative lens, quite often. They see it in a very negative way. Now, one of the men in our group in West LA was raised in a very violent family. His dad was a professional wrestler, and he used to beat him pretty bad. And he would also beat him. He would encourage him to fight with other young kids. And then if he lost, he would beat him after that. This guy grew up, his mother finally said to him, if you don't go into the military, I'm going to have you arrested. So he joined the Marines. And he said in a lot of ways the Marines were the best thing for him because they set up something he could count on. There was a routine. There was a structure that he never had in his own family. However, he also learned a lot about violence because he was trained to be violent. He, for years, probably until the last few years ago, would go to like Starbucks, and if somebody didn't wait on him right away, he would see that as a sign of disrespect. He always read negative intention into the behavior of other people that he didn't like. And of course, then he reacted in that way. He had street fights a lot. He didn't hit his wife. He did not believe in hitting animals or women. But he did things in front of his wife that let him know that he was pretty violent. So what we see in that case is you don't have to be violent to that person. They can be vicariously traumatized by watching you do what you do. The third thing is an overvalue of aggressive responses. So that violence is seen more as a solution to problems than a problem in and of itself. It's seen as it's seen as an appropriate reaction as opposed to a problem. The next thing is a low threshold for reacting. So they tend to react much more quickly than those people who have not been in contact, those people who have not been raised in violent families. There's a reaction time. Social isolation. A lot of veterans who come back become socially isolated. A lot of adult children who have been abused are, and we see that a lot with people in our groups, are socially isolated. Now, when you take that social isolation that you feel and you impose it on your family, it's a sign of PTSD to be socially isolated. It's a sign of domestic violence when you socially isolate your family, when you are, making sure about where they are. That is a sign of domestic violence. Hypervigilance is a symptom of PTSD, but being hypervigilant in terms of your partner is a sign of domestic violence. So when we see people who are stalking their partners, who are monitoring their phone calls, who are looking at their cell phones, who are installing spyware into the computer, that's a whole different issue. Now, when you look at other symptoms of PTSD and you look at adults abused as children, they manifest many of the same symptoms. Flashbacks are one of those symptoms. I want to tell you about one of my very first clients that I had in private practice. For the first probably 15 to 20 years of my private practice, it was all working with trauma. It was working with gang rape, domestic violence, and adults abused as children, a lot of incest survivors. So this young woman came in to see me. When she came in, she was a rager. She was depressed. She had very low self-esteem. She was socially isolated. She had almost every symptom of PTSD. And she came in, she really didn't want to come to therapy. She wasn't a big fan of therapy. But she felt pretty desperate because she couldn't hold a job. She was unable to hold a job because of her reactivity to other people. Now, she told me about probably a few months into therapy, she said to me, and by the way, she had a really good sense of humor, which was a saving grace. She said to me, "Have I told you that I throw up 4 or 5 times a day?" And I said, "No, you haven't, but I'm really glad you haven't, because there's only so much I can handle." And I thought that was funny. I don't know what you guys are doing, but anyway, I know it's early. But I said, I'm just a human being like you are, and she would connect with that. She would connect with that. But she came in one day, and she came in, and it was before anybody else was in the counseling center, and she came in like this. Like this, and I was terrified. I thought, what the heck is this? And I had never studied psychotic breaks, but I sort of recognized one that was right there, that she really was out of it. And it turns out she was having tangible flashbacks. She was hiding in a closet. She had tangible flashbacks of being molested. She could feel hands on her. Those things were happening to her. And I was watching her, we were sitting in my office, and I was watching her, and I was thinking, I don't know what to do. And if she could see how scared I felt inside, she would be terrified, because I don't know what to do. And I thought about it, and I thought, what would I do if one of my kids was having a night terror? Well, I'd put my arms around them, and I'd sit with them. And so that's what I did with her. I put my arms around her, and I just sat with her. And I rocked her, and I told her that things were going to be okay. And then I took her around the counseling center to show her that nobody was there that would hurt her, and that she was safe. And I saw her twice a week for 2 weeks after that. And she came in the fourth, she got better within the first week. I mean, she got herself more together. The fourth time she came in, she went, and I went, and she said, "Gotcha." I said, "Don't pull that one again." But I learned so much from her, and I'm still in touch with her. I saw her in the 80s, and she moved back east, and she has a 25-year relationship, and she's doing well. She'd never had sex sober in her life, but she was also terrified of her own anger. Think about how many people we work with who are so afraid. How many people have you worked with who say, "I just want to get rid of my anger"? Right? They talk about getting rid of their anger, which of course you can't do, but I thought, I experimented with her a lot. So I thought, I'm a therapist, I should have like a technique, that we're supposed to have techniques or something. And I thought, I'm not really a technique person, but I'm gonna do one with her. I'm gonna do an anger technique. She was terrified of her own anger. So I gave her that towel thing. Have you guys seen that, where you take one end of a towel, and the other person takes the other end, and they pull on it, you resist them, and they're supposed to say no. It's supposed to be to practice setting boundaries. Have you know that one? Yeah, probably because it's really so bad you don't even want to do it. So we're doing this towel thing, and she tells me I don't want to do anything aggressive, right? But do I listen? No, I do not. So I give her the end of the towel. After 2 pulls on this towel, she's gone. You can see she is totally gone. And she looks like she is actually going to kill me. Now, I respond to imminent death threats immediately. I let go of the towel, I drop the towel, and it took her a few minutes to come back. And I thought I should have listened to her. And I thought, she's so terrified of her own anger. She's afraid if she starts to get angry, that she will never stop being angry, that she will be more and more violent. So what I asked her, which is a technique attorneys use, ask a question that you know the answer to. I said, "Do you like classical music?" And she said, "Yeah, I love it." And I said, "Will you do this week? Will you go home and pick out the 3 most dramatic pieces of classical music? Get Scheherazade, get the 1812 Overture, get the Piano Concerto No. 1, and lead the orchestra. Throw your body into it. Just go, go nuts with it." And she said, "But I'd be so embarrassed." And I said, "Well, you live alone with your cat." I said, just give it a try. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. And that's where we started with her rage. We started with leading the orchestra. And then we could move, because big body movement's important. Females tend to do less of that than males. It's important to do that with females too, to use your body, to teach people to use their body in a non-aggressive way. So I did that with her, and then I tried another thing with her, which I tried guided imagery. Now, guided imagery can be very effective with PTSD if you're good at it, right? So I did guided imagery with her, and you know, it was practice. I hadn't really done it before. So I had her lay on the couch, and somehow, and I'm not sure how I did this, but I had her driving up to the mountains during rush hour traffic on a Friday, forgetting to feed her animals. And she started, I saw her shaking. Now, she was also someone who had seizures. And I thought, oh my God, I've thrown her into a total seizure. And then I realized that she was hysterically laughing. And she looked at me and she said, "You're not very good at this, are you?" And I said, "No, as a matter of fact, I think I suck." I said, "But look how well it worked on your depression." Because she was, you know, laughing, you know? She was laughing. She was feeling good. You can't laugh and feel bad at the same time. So she was laughing. Anyway, another incident with, in terms of people who are afraid of their own anger, a man in my group who was actually going to the VA, this was years ago, for work on his PTSD. And it was at the time when they used love bats. Do you remember the batakas, right? And they told him to hit the chair. And he said, "You don't want me to hit the chair." And the guy said, "Yes, I want you to hit the chair." Hit the chair. He said, "You don't want me to hit the chair." He refused to hit the chair. He had to leave the group because he said, "If I had started hitting, I wouldn't have stopped." Most of the folks we work with do not have to practice violence. They don't have to practice aggression. They have to practice being with their body in a non-aggressive way. So I want to talk about some of the symptoms and some of the things that I have done and worked with. And if you guys want to jump in and share some of the things you've done and that have worked for you, that would be terrific, because then everybody can hear it. But I want to talk about survivor guilt a little bit, which is one of the things that you see a lot with vets, but you also see it with adults abused as children. The child that was not the target of their parents or their caregiver, who feels bad and continues to feel bad about letting their sibling be hurt or injured. The child who has done better than the other children and has succeeded more in their lives. And I was watching the History Channel, and I saw something that I thought was incredibly interesting. It was the Secret Service men who were on the detail of the day of the Kennedy assassination. Did anybody see that? It was pretty amazing, wasn't it? These guys, of course, are older than I am, because I was a teenager during the Kennedy assassination. They were in the Secret Service. But I want to read some of the quotes, some of the things that they said about their lives now, because it was so impactful. One of the agents said, "We had to stuff our feelings. Our mission wasn't gone. Our careers weren't gone, but a piece of our lives was gone. And I wondered, could I have done anything better? I played handball with a CIA psychiatrist. I could beat out frustrations with that little ball, and he helped me to pull through those days. People talk about grieving. We had no time to grieve. Life went on and our schedules got busier. The image of the president's head exploding won't go away. I had a very rough time. I should have had therapeutic help. I didn't do it at all." The other, there were about 5 agents interviewed. The 5th one said, "I got really depressed. I went into a downward spiral. I got physically ill. Too much time to think about what had happened. A doctor told me I was going to kill myself with my drinking. If I had kept contact with other agents, it could have helped. They made you strong, but I cut myself off. I kept reliving it until I realized there was nothing I could have done." Doesn't that sound similar to so many of the people that we work with? in their lives, the images they have. And you know, the images, the body images and the memories people have so often are so dramatic. But the body images, the things that I think are so important about those are that they're oftentimes, because they're not tied to a cognitive memory, they make people feel crazy. And when you can tie it to something for the people you work with, they don't feel so crazy. I was talking to someone who had a reaction to their partner drinking. And if their partner drank, they felt very violent. They felt like they wanted to spit at this person. And they had no memory of why that would be in their lives, why they would feel those things. And it just felt awful. But there was no tangible recollection of why it would feel awful. So I suggested to her that she talk to her mother and ask her mother what she had seen as a child. And she said, "You saw your father come home staggering drunk. You saw your grandfather come home staggering drunk and spilling things and sloppy." No recollection of any of those things. But once there was an identification and the person didn't feel crazy anymore, it took the power away from that recollection. I worked with a young woman who was an incest survivor, and she said, "When I am sexual with my husband, I want to kill him." She had memory about what that was about, but she didn't know how to change it. And part of the reason that she didn't is because she continued to do the things that made her feel terrible about herself. She hurt her child. She put her hands around her child's neck. She verbally abused, particularly her little girl. And one of the things that I did with her was to have her be angry with her little girl when she wasn't angry at her little girl. So if her little girl came home from school and she was upset, to have her do jump rope with her little girl and turn the rope really fast and talk about why she was angry. But it wasn't personal. It wasn't like her little girl was mad at her. Now, the reason she was called into school at all was that her 6-year-old daughter was so depressed that she came to the attention of the administrators at school. Now imagine how depressed you'd have to be, because in the school system, we generally take care of the squeaky wheel, right? The kids that are most violent, the kids that act out, they get attention. The kids that are quiet and depressed, we don't have time enough to deal with the other kids, to deal with them. So her depression must have screamed. So we worked together for quite some time. We worked on her doing positive things about her, keeping a list of things she did that were good, that she felt proud of during the week, gratitude lists, all kinds of things. Physical acting, you know, doing physical things. I would sometimes do physical things with my clients, like I'd play catch with them, or I'd take them on walks so that their body was into it, whatever that was. At the end of about 1.5 years of working with her, she came in and she said, "I feel so good." Her daughter had run for president of her 3rd grade class. She was no longer depressed. She said, "My daughter and I walked through the mall, and she took my hand and she looked up at me with so much love and no fear." You have to accumulate enough evidence about your goodness to even begin to look at where you aren't. To begin to look at where you're not, you haven't been a good person. To begin to look at your shame, right? So I was talking, we had group the other night, and one of the things that we did was pass out these cards. And the guys take a card randomly. And one of the guys got a card that said, say something nice about everybody in the room. Now, I can only tell you how hard this was for him. And he said, can I go last? And he did, and he could, and he's not a real verbal guy. But he went around and he could say one word. But what it started was kind of a chain reaction, so that the other guys in the room wanted to say something nice. The experience of giving an emotional gift is so powerful. They felt so good about it. But one of the guys in group said to me, he said, you know, Alyce, when I first met you, I thought, oh God, this woman's going to eat me alive. And I said, why did you think that? And he said, well, because you're a woman, because I was domestically abusive. And I just thought, well, you know stuff. I read some stuff about you. You're going to eat me alive. And he said, and then during the intake, you'd be sitting in the chair and you'd be going like this. And he said, you were shaking your head. Did you know you were shaking your head? I said, nervous tick. I said, no. I said, I think I shake my head when I think, yeah, I get that, or yeah, I get that. He said, I thought you were setting me up. I thought you were shaking your head yes, so that you could come and get me right at the end. You'd give me a big smack and you'd get, he said, and I found out that wasn't true, so it was really pretty good. But we were looking at the notion of shame, because this young man, this is his third go-round in group. He's been in 3 groups now. Well, he's been in our group twice. First time he went to a group, the second time he came to our group. The third time, he said, he called me and he gave his full name and he introduced himself on the phone message. And I called him back and I said, why did you introduce yourself? He said, I was so ashamed that I had done something again. I was so ashamed. And he said, I didn't want you to think that I expected anything special from you, but I knew I had to come back to this group. And when I think of guilt, I think guilt is about a lesson, right? It's about learning something. But shame is about who you are. Shame is about a commentary on yourself, and it's deeper than guilt. But both guilt and shame exacerbate anger and rage. A lot of the times people that we work with look in the eyes of someone they've hurt, or someone who looks like someone they've hurt, and they're reacting to that guilt. So I was thinking about guilt, I was thinking about shame, I was thinking about rationalization, right? Rationalization is one of the ways we deal with our guilt and our shame. Somebody said to me, Alyce, what would you rather do without? Would you rather do without sex or rationalization? I had to think about it. I'm a little older. They said, have you ever gone a week without a really good rationalization? I thought, probably not, right? Most of us are really good at that. How many of you have ever seen the Woody Allen film, Crimes and Misdemeanors? If you want to see a really good film about how domestic violence works in the mind of the perpetrator and the victim, see Crimes and Misdemeanors. Crimes and Misdemeanors is about a doctor, a dentist, who has a mistress. He's married, he lives in Scarsdale, New York, he's got lots of money, and he has a mistress that he's had for 10 years. He's got a couple kids and a wife that he's had for longer than the mistress. And he promises the mistress that when the kids get older and they go away to school, that he will divorce his wife and marry her. So she's doing a little rationalization for 10 years and believing that's going to happen, right? And so the kids grow up, they go away to school, and the mistress says to him, you know, basically, yippee-ki-yay, now we can get married. And he says, well, not really, because you know, we don't have the kind of divorce laws they have other places in New York, I would lose my shirt. I would lose so much of my income because I've been married over 20 years. I can't really afford it. My kids still kind of count on me emotionally. So let's just keep it the way it is. So the mistress gets furious. And she basically says, I'm going to pull your covers, man. I'm going to call your wife. Everybody's going to know about this. Now, this man who has no relationship with his brother, because his brother's like a major thug, and he has no contact with him, calls his brother. And he says to his brother, he tells him what's happened, and he says, boy, I wish I didn't have this problem. So a couple days later, he calls his brother again, and he says, you know, I haven't heard from her. And his brother said, well, you won't. I had her killed. You don't have a problem anymore. The whole film is how this goes from a crime to a misdemeanor in his own mind. That what used to be this horrific thing now becomes a misdemeanor in his mind, and how he begins to rationalize it, how he begins to blame the victim, that if she hadn't done this, how he distances himself from any responsibility because he didn't do it, his brother did it, it wasn't him. It is a brilliant film, I think, about the way our minds work when they need to work that way. Minimizing and denying serve a purpose for people who are returning from combat as well as the people we work with. I do not expect people who come in and meet me for the first time to tell me the truth. I do not expect them to tell me the truth for a while. I think it's going to take, how many of you have had the experience that it takes at least 6 months to begin to even cut through the BS, right? And if you've got people a lot longer than that, right, don't they begin to tell you? I mean, I hear things, I have in my West LA group, over half the group's been there over 4 years by their own choice. Those guys tell you things that you would never have heard because they see the nuances of things that they never would have seen before. They see the nuances of their behavior. They understand how they might be intimidating by not ever hitting anybody, by the expression on their face. Remember, one of the guys said, you know, I don't even have to hit my wife anymore. I just have to give her that look. I said, well, I guess we're going to have to start working on your face then. Because it's the nuance, right, that begins to happen. So you start to see things in a different way. Now, when you're dealing with shame, it takes a long time for someone to trust you enough to tell you what they're ashamed about, right? I mean, think about that for any of us. Most of us have something we're ashamed of. I was thinking about when I was listening to Ruth Beaglehole, who does Echo Nonviolent Parenting. I was listening to her speak, and one of the things she asked the audience is, how many of you have children? So I'll ask you, how many of you have children? Okay. How many of you who have children have never done anything you're ashamed of? Except for Bob Geffner, who has never ever done anything he's ashamed of, period. Right, Bob? But Bob, you know what, Bob? You remind me of Bill, my co-facilitator that I worked with for 28 years, because anytime I would ask a question like that, Bill would always raise his hand and say, not me, not me. It's never been me. Anyway, but shame is a heavy-duty thing, and I think about one of the men in our program who was interestingly, he was in AA. He didn't say much actually about what he'd done ever. He never talked too much about what he'd done. And we decided to celebrate his AA birthday with him. But instead of doing a cake, we did a pie, because he'd already been around, made the circuit of all the AA meetings and gotten his cakes. So we gave him a pie. And at that meeting, he said, I want to tell you guys something that I don't think I've ever told you before. Did I tell you that I was really jealous and I went to my girlfriend's house with a gun, and I started firing rounds around her house because I never really trusted that she didn't have another guy in there. I wanted to see who ran out. And he said nobody did. Now the guys in group are going, what? You know, and he said, and then that kind of wasn't enough for me. So I broke into her car and I used an axe and I chopped up the dashboard stuff. He said, and then I really still didn't trust her, and he said, I set her car on fire. Now the guys in group are looking at him like, are you kidding me? What, you know, they'd never heard any of this before. And I said to him, you must be feeling pretty good about yourself. And he said, why do you say that? I said, because you never would have said this in this group if you didn't trust that you could say it in this group and that they like you enough that they could hear it and still like you. That you had done enough good things yourself that you could put in perspective the things that you had done that weren't so hot. And that's one of the things I think that is our job to do, is to help people put things in perspective. And I think about that with veterans. When I worked at the VA hospital, and I was a kid, I was 21 years old, these young guys would come in and they just wanted to talk. And the therapist, and at that time at the VA, it's different at the VA, and Manny, I have great respect for you. Manny works at the VA and has done tremendous work over the years with veterans. But when I worked in the VA in the 60s, at the Long Beach VA, the vets used to tell me, it was a spinal cord injured center of the country. The vets used to tell me that it was they were experimented on. They frequently told me they were experimented on. And in order to get even a bone set, if you had a broken bone, you had to sign a release to have electroconvulsive surgery, therapy at that time. But at that time, the psychiatrists were sort of weird. They were like, I thought, like way weirder than any of the guys in the hospital. Like one of them had a little Sigmund Freud beard and little Sigmund Freud glasses, and he looked like little Sigmund Freud, and he kind of acted like little Sigmund Freud. And another guy was like, he was a recovering gynecologist who became a psychiatrist, and he would say, I am very glad to be here in this group. Mr. Goose is helping me out quite a bit. You know, and I'm observing, you know, I'm supposed to be learning. So I think it was a relief to these guys to just talk to somebody that was decent to them. I didn't know anything. I had a white lab coat only because we were supposed to wear one. I didn't know what to do with it. But they would come in and talk, and there were 3 of us students, and we used to come back from lunch, and there would be wheelchairs lined up to talk to us, because we would just listen to them, because we didn't know what to say, we didn't know what to do, we just listened. And I had young men who told me about killing children in Vietnam, because they never knew if one of those children was carrying a live grenade, because that's what would happen. And we see that now in the Middle East as well, where children are dangerous. But what do you do with yourself when you've killed a child? How do you make that okay? You have to come to a place with that. So working with the shame, and I want to tell one more shame story, because this was a victim of domestic violence. Now, you know that our clients are mostly victims of domestic violence. They're grown-up victims, but they're victims of domestic violence. Most of them judge themselves and their childhood behavior through an adult lens. Have you noticed that? They look at themselves and they think, I could have done this or that, but they're looking at it through an adult lens and not through a child's lens. They'd never judge another child the way they judge themselves. But this young woman had basically a healthy background. And the reason I want to say this is because oftentimes we judge the partners of the men in our groups. Sometimes we only listen to the men or women in our groups and we have no contact. And we hear these stories about the partners and how whacked they are, right? We all get those stories? And how many of you have heard that the codependent is sicker than the alcoholic? Have you heard that? So who's telling us those stories? Okay, so think about that. Think about the stories. Because when I hear, you know, from most of the victims that I hear from, they are taking more responsibility than the folks in our group, but it makes sense, doesn't it? It makes sense that it would be hard to come into a program and say, I hurt the people that I love. So this young woman, and I'm telling you this story because she was the victim of domestic violence. She was a pretty healthy young woman, very successful in her business, had been in business for about 10 years, was well respected, was a well respected designer. She came in because she had been married to a man who was on the far end of the spectrum in terms of people we deal with. Most of us are not dealing with the perpetrator who is in Sleeping with the Enemy, The Burning Bed, J-Lo's Enough, right? That is the rare kind of person that we work with and see in our groups. So she was with that kind of guy, a guy who never got treatment, but a guy who was very insidious in terms of what he did. And most of what he did was psychologically abusive. It was gaslighting stuff, but it was very powerful stuff. And she had seen me for over 1.5 years before she said to me, I have to tell you this. I have to tell somebody. She said, I had a cat that I loved before I was married. And this cat was like my baby. And she said, one day after I got married, I came home when my partner was throwing my cat across the room. And she said, I got very upset. And I said, you cannot hurt my cat, what, you know? And she said, he gave me this explanation. He totally apologized. He said it would never happen again. He said, he explained that he had freaked out, that he was under a lot of pressure. She found out later he was under a lot of pressure because he was scamming elderly people out of a lot of money. And he was having a hard time scamming as many people, so his money was a little shorter. He was short of funds. She said, I never saw him do anything to my cat after that. But I came home and the food dish would be empty or the water dish would be empty, and that had never been true the whole time that I had, you know, before I was married. She said, I came home one day and my cat had a bleeding paw. And she said, I asked him what had happened, and he said, oh, I broke a glass. I thought I cleaned it all up. I must have forgotten. And she said, then after I was with him for a few years, she said, he picked up my cat one day and he took it to the car, and I knew I would never see my cat again, and I didn't stop him. And she was so ashamed of her behavior. And I think that we need to acknowledge that when we are working with people, and we need to recognize that the people that we're working with are oftentimes afraid to tell us what they've done, but are more than willing to pass judgment on their partners. And I'm not saying partners are perfect. I'm just saying it's easier to level the playing field, right? One of the reasons, you know, we talk about not doing couples counseling because couples counseling can be dangerous. That looks like the first reason. But I think there are a few other reasons that we don't want to do couples counseling at the beginning of a relationship, an abusive relationship when they come in. One of them is that the person who, if there's a good guy, bad guy situation, like a perpetrator, and there is an attempt by the perpetrator to level the playing field, to make what you do as bad as what I do, right? So I need to figure out how to do that. So I'm going to remember what the therapist said about you, but I'm probably not going to remember what the therapist said to me, or the direction to me. The third reason is that by the time somebody gets into counseling, what you often see is a rage from the victim. And so you bring them into counseling together, and who looks like the victim? The perpetrator looks like the victim, because we see this anger and rage, and they're not ready. You might as well have a referee's shirt and a whistle if you're going to see them. The fourth reason I don't see people together at the beginning is if you ever want the person who is perpetrating the violence to feel decently about themselves, you can't continue to confront them in front of the people they hurt. They always feel like the bad guy. They never get out of that place. And you'll hear the guys say, right, in group, and I work in men's groups, so that's why I keep saying guys, but I've worked with female perpetrators, just not in group, but they'll say, when is she ever going to get over it? When's she going to appreciate it? I haven't called her a name in 3 weeks, for God's sake. You know, like, what's up? You know, when's she going to let it go? One of the guys in our West LA group, they call him the Buddha, and his legend lives on. He's been gone from group for 10 years, but his legend has been passed on. And believe me, his legend just keeps getting bigger. Listen, I don't even recognize the guy anymore, because he is like the Buddha. And now they say, it was about 1.5 years before his wife started calling him love words again. She started calling him by a pet name again. And it was a little longer than that before she felt close to him again. So now the guys in group have made it 3 years before she called him. And the guys that are just starting are going, are you kidding me? 3 years? You know, I said, no, it wasn't that long, but the story gets bigger. The legend grows. Anyway, but it takes a while for forgiveness to happen, right? You have to have, and this is the nuance of, I think, what people who stay in the program longer get, is that they don't have to hit somebody anymore. They just have to do some of the things they used to do, and the person flashes back. Because it's not just the adult survivors who are flashing back. It's not just the veterans who are flashing back. It is also the victims that are flashing back. And that flashback behavior does not end for a while. It takes a long time for that to go on. Now, one of the things I like to look at when I'm doing this work is an assessment, and I do this usually in the intake session. I want to do an assessment of dangerousness, right? And I think one of the reasons that I've always tried to interview the partners is because it is the best way to do an assessment of dangerousness. There is the story, and there is the new revised edition of the story. As one of the men in my program who said, when I asked him if he had any problems with alcohol or if he felt like he drank too much, he said, no, I'm a social drinker. I have a couple martinis at night. His wife totally agreed that he had a couple of martinis at night, because I asked them some of the same questions. But she said, the problem is that his martinis are in a big glass. So his 2 martinis are about 6 martinis. That's the difference in the story. One of the men in our program never, ever admitted to holding a gun on his wife and his sister-in-law. But his wife said to me, are you going to tell anybody what I tell you? And I said, unless it involves child abuse or a danger to yourself or others, no. No, a danger from him to self or others, no. She said, he really had a gun that night. He really held a gun on us. He never, the entire time in group, would talk about that. But what you can do with that information is talk in general about the threat of weapons. You can talk about what people fear or what you think people fear. You can tailor your intervention with that person or with those people, because you have more information to be able to do that with. So when I do assessments, one of the things I talk to people about are styles of anger. So I'm going to do that with you guys. I'm going to ask you, how many of you would consider yourselves more volatile when you get angry? And when I say that, I mean maybe your eyeballs pop out of your head a little bit, maybe the veins stand out on your neck, maybe you move your arms around, maybe your voice gets louder, maybe you drool a little bit out of the corner of your mouth. How many of you would say that you're more volatile when you get angry? And the rest of you are passive aggressive, is that right? Okay. Well, let me ask the volatile folks, what does it mean to you when you're trying to communicate with a partner, somebody that's really important for you to communicate with? And they stand here like this. They don't say anything. They look at you. How do you feel when that's going on? Get angrier?
Yeah.
You get angrier. Okay, so take that a step further. Why do you get angrier? What does it mean to you?
It's fine. It's an affront. It's very offensive in that way.
Yeah.
It's an affront? Okay, so take it a step further. What if it is an affront? What does it mean to you then?
Is it called mask anger?
What's that?
Not this.
Okay, well, you're rare, because most people tend to get pissed.
Probably.
And they get pissed because they believe that the person is, we make a hostile intention. We perceive a hostile intention, right? We perceive that that person is disregarding us, that they don't care about us, that they're trying to piss us off with their silence, right, on purpose. We're making a bunch of assumptions about it. Now, for those of you who are more passive with your anger, how do you feel when somebody is more aggressive and they're coming at you or they're louder? How do you feel?
Intimidated.
Intimidated?
They don't care.
They don't care. Okay, so we're doing they don't care, we're intimidated, because if you look like that when you were mad, it would mean you're homicidal, right? So we tend to judge people on our yardstick. Wrong yardstick. We tend to see people as more dangerous who are different than we are. One night in group, we had a light bird colonel from Special Forces who came into group, and he was asked by the men, why are you here? And he said, they said it was terrorist threats. Now, this was before we started calling it criminal threats, after 9/11. He said, threats. I said, well, what kind of threats did you make? He said, well, I told my wife that if she didn't let me see my son this weekend, I would put her in the trunk of my car and I would take her on a one-way trip. He said, and then after that, I called my sister-in-law. And I told my sister-in-law the same thing. Now, this was not a particularly bright light bird colonel thing to do, because he left it on the answer machine. And they took it to the police, and the police arrested him, right? So I looked at him and I said, you know, you've been in combat, you've been trained to kill, you're in Special Forces. If you said that to me, I would take it very seriously. And he sort of blew me off, like, you know, well, you're just, you know, you're a woman, you just get scared easy kind of thing, I think is what he was thinking. But after group that night, two of the biggest, most volatile guys in group came up and said, you know, Al, that guy is scary. You know, those quiet ones. You know what they're like. You know, they said, you know, I think he's the kind of guy who could come to group next week and he could have a gun and he could shoot us all. And I said, well, I don't think he's going to do that. And I thought later, well, what if I'm wrong? And then I thought, well, there'll be no witnesses. So what happened was I said to them, are you guys willing to tell him that he scares you? And they said, well, we're scared. And I said, well, think about it, because I think it would be a very powerful thing if this week you were able to think about why he scares you and what he does that intimidates you and be able to tell him that. And that's exactly what they did the next week. They said, your voice had no feeling in it, it was flat. Your eyes were cold, your jaw was clenched. They told him exactly why he was scary, and he listened to them because they were big guys, and he was sort of stunned that he was capable of scaring these big guys. So looking at assessment, being able to look at who you're dealing with, finding out if you're dealing with a veteran, if the veteran's been in combat, is an important thing to find out. How recently, if they've had treatment. One of the things I also like to find out, I like to find out about substance abuse. Not just whether or not, I find out about a lot of things, by the way, but I'm giving you some highlights. One of the things to find out about substance abuse is not only if somebody's currently using, but how long they have been in recovery if they are. Because they can be very dangerous if they are newly in recovery. And I'm talking about a year. I'm talking about longer than a year. They can be very dangerous because they now are a perpetrator without an anesthetic. And so it is important to look at how long, and also if they are doing it cold turkey, or are they going to a program? Do they have a sponsor? One of my clients said, well, my husband, who was addicted to steroids, over-the-counter medication, and alcohol, is going to AA. And I said to her, ask him what step he's on, and ask him if he has a sponsor. And she said, okay. And she came back the next week and she said, when I asked him what step he was on, he just looked at me like, what are you talking about? You don't even have to be in AA to know there are steps, right? Okay, and then when she asked him about a sponsor, he didn't know what that was either. So you knew darn well he wasn't going to AA. Now, a lot of our clients are smart and they get people to sign their cards for them, right? Or they sign them themselves, or they have a friend do it. But it's important to find out if somebody's working the steps, and to find out what step they're on, and to find, that kind of stuff. It's also one of the things I like to find out are the non-physical kinds of aggression that someone has done. If they're calling names, what kind of names? You want to know the difference between character assassination and generic name calling. There is a difference. And somebody tearing somebody's character apart and calling them a bitch. There's a difference. Even though being called a bitch is not cool, being called a bastard isn't cool, but being told that you're ugly and that nobody would ever want you and that you're stupid and that you're a lousy partner and that you're a lousy parent, those are different things. You want to know the nature of what people are doing. You want to know if there are threats and the kind of threats. I mean, most people we work with threaten abandonment, right? Most of them don't threaten to kill the other person. They may threaten suicide, but you want to get the context of that. Many of the people we work with stalk their partners, but they stop doing it, or it diminishes once they know the partner means business. We rarely deal with a real stalker, but the real stalkers are the ones that once they know you mean business, escalate in their behavior and the nature of the behavior. So you want to know the nature of what people are doing, not just the act that they do, but the nature of the act that they're doing. Now, there's a program that I worked with that I loved that was for the Marines called Heroes in Healthy Families. And you can Google it, and it's a full day of training. Pam Iles, Judge Pamela Iles from Orange County, who was one of the first domestic violence court judges, who was a tremendous and creative domestic violence court judge. When she retired, she started, or before she retired, she started this program for the Marines. I love the whole philosophy of it. One of the things that happens in the military is there's been a culture of people being unable to ask for help, right? Even though theoretically there's help and there's family services, there is a culture that says asking for help is weakness. The way this program starts is that a general gets up And he talks about the notion of not leaving your buddy behind and being inclusive in that, talking about it in terms of mental health issues. If you believe your buddy is suicidal, if you believe your buddy is using too much in terms of drugs and alcohol, if you believe your buddy is abusing their partner or their child, that we need to be addressing these issues, and we have a way to address them. They would bring like anywhere from 400 to 800 Marines from all over the country. We were in Atlanta, Georgia, and Camp Lejeune, and in North Carolina, at Camp Pendleton. And they would bring usually a lot of NCOs and enlisted men. So there are a lot of sergeants there and enlisted men, hoping to train the trainers. Now, in the course of this day, they had a general and his wife who had lost one son in combat, and the other son, who was in the military, had killed himself. And they talked about the impact of suicide and what they didn't know. There's a guy named Black Jack. Black Jack, they call him Black Jack. He was, I think, a colonel in Vietnam, and he unscrews his leg. He takes his artificial leg off to let people know about his injury, but he also says, you know, I hear people talking about alcoholics. He said, that sounds like a wine and cheese kind of guy. He said, I was just a drunk. And he talks about substance abuse. So I talked about PTSD and domestic violence. So and then there was a speaker that talked about healthy families and coming home from the war. I thought it was such a wonderful program, and we were able to hook people up with resources right there at that day. I had a young man come up to me and said, can I be in your group? And I said, do you live in California? And he said, no. I said, where do you live? And we hooked him up right away with a program. There was another young man who came up and he was crying. And he said, my son's afraid of me. My 5-year-old is afraid of me. I need help. We were able to hook him up right away. I have been very impressed with the family services people I've met in the military. I've met really great people. So I think, you know, there are resources there that are so important. My dream for domestic violence is that we become AA. It becomes so acceptable for people to go into a batterers intervention program, and maybe we stop calling them batterers intervention programs. I don't know what we call them. Free to be you and me, whatever the heck we call them. I don't know, but I don't think people like being labeled in particular. And that name's a really bad name. I remember one time, though, the men in Long Beach and the men in West LA were going to challenge each other to a baseball game. And we said, we should get team shirts. And they said, we want to be called the West Side Batterers. So I don't know. Anyway, but I don't think that's the name most people like. But wouldn't it be cool if people could talk about going to these programs and it was praised and it was a good thing? I was talking at a Girl Scout, a 75th anniversary of the Girl Scouts, and they had a community panel, and there were like 4 of us from different agencies in the community, and one of the people said, God, I got to get out of this, you know, right away because I have to go to my AA meeting. And one of the other panelists said, oh, you go to AA? I go to ACA and NA. And the other one said, oh, you do? I go to Al-Anon and ISA. Where do you go, Alyce? And I said, Weight Watchers. I just wanted to be an A. Do you know what I mean? I think that we could make this, and that should be a mission that we have to begin to make this something that people can say, I go to a program because I hurt people and I want to stop and I'm going to change. And we ought to think of a year as no time at all, because a year is nothing, right? A year is nothing in a 12-step program. It is nothing in a program where somebody has crossed one more social taboo than that. Just quickly, there is Casey Taft is doing a psychoeducational 12-week program. He basically broke it down in the ways we kind of do our program into 3 phases. Stage 1 was education, stage 2 was conflict management, stage 3 was communication. A lot of the skills that we're doing over a minimum of a year. And by the way, when I go around the country, people want, nobody, you know, there are like 3 states that do a year. Nobody else does. They all want more time with the people they're working with. Casey's program is very psychoeducational. Now that is our mandate, but I think if we are not dealing with the trauma in our clients, then we are shortchanging our clients big time. That we cannot just do psychoeducational programs. And anybody who's doing this work for any length of time knows that. That we have to be engaging with the people we work with. They have to trust us. They have to believe that they know we can change. And so I want to talk about just a couple things that I think are important. One of the things that I think of in my head as a wonderful metaphor for for working with domestic violence is the martial art of Aikido. Are you familiar with Aikido? Aikido is the martial art of reconciliation. And there are 3 basic premises in Aikido. The first one is that we should not put ourselves in a situation that is dicey for us, right? Don't put yourself in the situation, which is what we do with our guys in timeout, right? Our clients, is know yourself. Know how you feel. Are you tired? As they say in AA, halt. Are you too hungry, too angry, too lonely, too tired? What is it, you know, what state am I in? But then learn to pay attention to the other person's state. So if you come home from your group and you're all up and you want to talk to your partner and they've had a tough day, don't do it then. Timing's important. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you find yourself in a dicey situation, think your way out of it. Now, isn't that what we work on a lot in group, is alternate appraisals, different ways of seeing things. Problem solving is empowerment. So let's talk about how we're going to work on this situation. We have people bring in their issues and talk about them in group and how they're going to work it out. And the third thing is that aggression of any sort, physical or psychological aggression, verbal aggression, is a last resort. Imagine if we could get the folks we're working with to think like that. Imagine how terrific that would be. Because by the time you get to step 3, you've already worked it out. You've already been successful in your timeout. You've already figured out, you've already talked yourself down, you've already spent your physical energy, you've already started thinking about what's the real issue for me. You've already done that. Okay, now, there's a story of a martial arts expert from this country who goes to Japan, and he gets on Shinkansen, the speed train in Japan. As he gets on the speed train, he sees a man who is drunk and who is aggressive, and he's just pushed a woman, and he's being verbally aggressive to other people. And the black belt from this country starts to take this guy out. And before he can do it, an elderly man walks up to this guy and he says, "What do you have in your lunchbox?" And it sort of startles the guy, and he says, "Persimmons and soup." And the man said, "Oh, you've got persimmons? Well, I grow persimmon trees." He said, "What kind of persimmons do you have?" And the guy starts to say something, and then he says, "And what kind of soup do you have?" And the man tells him, and he says, "You must have a wife who loves you a lot to spend the time to make that soup." And the man begins to cry. And he said, "I had a wife who loved me until 3 weeks ago, and my wife died." And he said, the martial arts expert from this country said, "I learned the true meaning of Aikido, which is getting to the heart." He said, "My first reaction was going to be aggression." And this elderly man diffused the situation, and he said, and when I got off the speed train, this man was lying in this elderly man's lap, and the elderly man was patting him. So I think, you know, it's our mission, isn't it? To get to the heart, to get through under the anger, to get past that, to be able to connect with the folks we work with. To see group as community, that group is family, that group gives people a chance And I think about this with vets, the ability, I think about that with the Secret Service, to talk to other people like you who get it. Now, there are always people in group who are doing things that they think nobody else is going to get. But they wind up talking about things, and I thought, you know, men are not used to giving emotional gifts, telling each other that they are, you know, what they think in a good way. And I was thinking about how lovely that was, that the men gave each other those gifts last night. And I had one of my friends from Japan, Nori Yamaguchi, who started, and a lot of you know Nori. Nori started one of the first Batterers intervention programs in Japan. No court orders in Japan. She has a program called AWARE. And Nori came here to do a study tour. And she said, Alyce, can I come observe your group? So I always ask the men in group. They make the decisions about what happens in group. It's their group. I sort of model it like a healthy family. And so Nori came, and that night, this was a group, interesting group. They voted to have her come. 8 men under the age of 24 years old in a group of 12. It was like a testosterone fest in that room. I mean, if you can imagine all these young guys, and I was thinking the guys that have been there longer, you know, would cool the jets on these other guys, but they actually took it as a challenge, that they had to be like, as, you know, it was a trip. But this night in group, one of the men who has one of the biggest problems with his adult children, who have a very hard time accepting him or forgiving him for the things he did, got a card. We passed out cards that night. And his card that he picked said, how do I want my children to remember me? And he started to cry. And he said, how can I tell them that this is all there is? And I said, you just made a really good start. And then I said to the young men, I said, what would you want your father to say to you? What would you want your father to say to you if you needed something from him? And all of those young men gave him something. They gave him a wonderful gift. And at the end of group that night, one of the guys says, group hug. And we all hugged each other. We had this big group hug. And Nori said, after everybody left, Alyce, I can't believe this. In this country, people do this. And I said, well, Nori, it doesn't usually happen. But, you know, I mean, if I could have picked like the perfect group, you know, it was like, oh my God, this group is so perfect tonight. You know how you have this perfect group and you want it to happen every week? But it doesn't happen every week. But it happened that week, and it was so terrific. So I want to tell you, I've got time for a couple stories. I'm going to tell you about a couple guys who were in our group and have been in our group for quite some time. One of them, and I can tell you his name because he, one of the things he did for ABIP was to, one of the things, that's my time person. One of the things he did for ABIP was to come and speak during my day of training. He came and spoke on being in a program and what worked for him and what didn't. He was, when he came into group, he was just this shy of 7 feet tall. He weighed about 280 pounds. He was a very huge man. He came in because he broke his wife's neck. He had, now he had broken his wife's neck a year before, but he had hurt her again, and they went to the emergency room, and the emergency room x-rayed her, saw that her neck was broken, and reported him to the police. So he came and enrolled in group as a preemptive strike, right? So that he wouldn't, he was hoping it would help keep him out of jail. Well, it didn't. He went to jail. He served 2 years in the penitentiary. We wrote to him while he was in jail. When he came back, he joined group, and he was in group another 7 years. During the time that he was in group, he became an inspiration, not only to the other guys, but what he did for his community service was he worked in a convalescent home. Now, I'm real tired of the guys we work with being on the road picking up trash, because I think it'd be really cool if they did community service that dealt with empathy and the development of empathy. So he was working with old people and he was reading to them, and he learned things, and he started working with one of the other men started working with the disabled, and he had to lift people into their chairs, and he did a lot of work. And I think we ought to be talking to probation, we ought to be talking to community service about routing some of our guys when there's abuse involved, about that whole notion of empathy and learning to empathize with other people. There are lots of organizations that could use that kind of help. And you know, most of our guys are not dangerous to other people. They're just not. Some of them are. You weed them out. But most of them are not. So, Dave developed cancer. And he developed cancer of the tongue, the throat, and the vocal cords. And he had to get 2/3 of his tongue removed, and they built him a new tongue with skin from his arm. They told him he would never speak again. Within 8 months, he was talking again. He wasn't talking as clearly as he used to talk, but he was talking, and he was speaking about the need for men to change their behavior, the need for people to think differently about the way they talk about women. He was talking to kids who were in prison. The guys in group used to say, "Hey, Dave, stick out your tongue, we want to see the hair." Because his arm had hair on it, he now had hair on his tongue. He had a great sense of humor. His cancer metastasized. He got a feeding tube. He was in group until 3 weeks before he died. The men in group volunteered to do round-the-clock hospice with him, 3 of the men in group. Many of us were with him when he was dying and spent time with him when he was dying. For me, I think that family is so important to so many of the people we work with. That notion that we care and that we want them to know that they have people they can count on. For so many, they have not had people in their lives they can trust. That's our job. Our job is not just to teach people what domestic violence is, it's to teach them what it isn't, right? That's our job. So I want to tell one more story, and it's a story some of you have heard before about my man in the mafia. Have you all heard how many of you have heard my story about the man in the mafia? Do you want to hear it again?
Of course.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I don't have anything else to say. So, okay. So one of the guys that came into my group actually is from the mafia in New Jersey, which, by the way, is the real mafia. I'm from New Jersey. We have to be proud of something. We have the mafia, okay? Let's get that clear. So he came into group not because he beat up women, because he had hospitalized women, and he didn't think that was a big issue. He came into group because he had become, when he got out of jail, he became a successful multimillionaire businessman because he had all the leadership skills he needed, which is what many of our clients who are gangs and whatever, they are natural leaders and they have natural skills. And one of the compliments he was given the other night is, "You are a leader. You are one of our leaders." And he's feeling real cool about that, I'll tell you. But he came in because in a business deal, he stuck a gun in a guy's throat, down his mouth, and threatened to blow his head off because the guy owed him some money. Now, he had a hair trigger on the gun. You know what a hair trigger is? You've heard of a hair trigger temper? It's where you just touch. He said, "I don't know why I didn't pull the trigger on him." Now later, when we got into nuances, I said to him, "What did the guy look like when you looked into his eyes? Because you were looking into his eyes, what did he look like?" He said he was really scared. I said, "Did he look like you when he was a little boy? When you were a little boy? Did he have it?" Because he was a very bad, well, I'll tell you about his history. Anyway, he came into group because what happened when he pulled the gun out of the guy's mouth is he shot himself in the foot. But he was so darn mad he didn't know he shot himself in the foot till he met his friend for lunch. And his friend said, "Hey man, you have blood coming out of your shoe." And he said, "Oh shit, I must have shot myself in the foot." And the guy said, "I think you have an anger management problem." Which I thought was a clever little euphemism, you know? So he comes in, he goes to Kaiser, and Kaiser refers him to us. So he comes in, and the first night I met him was his second night in group. And he literally got up and started to go after this guy across the room who's talked about being violent with his child. And this guy has a big, giant reaction to that. And I had to get between them. And I looked at him and I said, "Don't make me embarrass you in front of everybody." And he just laughed, and he liked me after that. His history is this. He was born in prison. His mother was in the mafia. He was born in prison. He was taken away from his mother at birth. He was given to family who didn't want him and couldn't handle him, and they put him in an orphanage. He was in the orphanage, and the Catholic priest beat him, but there was one in particular who beat him a lot. And he told this priest, "When I get old enough, I'm going to come back and I'm going to kill you." And he actually did go back to kill this priest. And he said the priest was lucky, he was already dead. When he was about 11 or 12 years old, he escaped from the orphanage, and he lived on the street, and he got involved in organized crime. He did a lot of time in prison. He was in Rikers in New York. He was in Trenton State, New Jersey. He was in California prisons. He was in isolation. He saw people die all the time. He said, "The miracle in my life is that I'm alive." So he was in group about 3 or 4 months, and he came in one night and he said, "This guy owes me $1,500. He hasn't paid me. I'm blowing his effing kneecaps off." And I said, "Well, you can't do that." And he said, "I'm not doing it. I'm hiring somebody." So we have low standards for success in our program. Okay, anyway, you know how probation wants you to have everybody talk in group every week? You know how sometimes that's just impossible? This was one of these times, and it was just impossible. You had to spend time with somebody you knew who had killed people, who was talking about killing somebody else. And is anybody wondering about terrorist off or duty to warn? Is anybody wondering why we wouldn't be doing that? We had no knowledge of the intended victim. We had nobody to tell the police about. We would have to say, there is an unknown person in the state of California, we think in Southern California, who this guy wants to kill. We couldn't do it. So what did we do? We spent the night working on a safety plan for him not to be violent. And I think everybody in that room learns something that night. They learn about what it feels to be in a room with somebody whose rage and anger fills that room, and they have no control over it, and they didn't start it, and they don't know how to stop it. They learn that when somebody is that raging, you better be real careful about when you say anything. And you better think about what you're going to say, and you better time it right. All the skills that you need for your own intimate relationship. And you need to learn that sometimes somebody else's problems are bigger than yours, right? So what we did that week was to get him to promise that, and give his word, and by the way, his word was golden to him. If he gave you his word, if you could get him to give his word, he kept it, because that was a real source of pride for him. So he gave his word that if he started to escalate, he would call either Bill or myself. We co-facilitated. He promised that he would do no physical violence to this guy within the next week. And 3 of the men in group agreed to call him during the week to check up on him. So we had that plan in place. The next week he came back and he said, "Hey, I took care of it. I solved the problem." I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "I just called the guy. I said, 'Hey man, I'm in one of those violence groups. He said, it's about all I can do to hang on to myself. He said, that guy was over in 15 minutes, paid him everything he owed him. I said, nice use of group. So this was a guy that you really had to do everything with. I mean, this was a guy who said to you, you guys talk about your parents hurting you, but I never had a parent that tucked me in once. And I know you guys had somebody who at least tucked you in at night. I never had that. I never had anybody say you're good. I never had anybody say you're worthwhile. I never had anybody say, I love you. He said, I don't even know what that means. So I asked him, do you know people who love people? He said, I have a couple guys that love their wives. I said, watch them. Act as if. Watch what they do. Be them. And then we role played. We had a guy in group who loved to role play. He was everybody's wife in group. He was great too. I think he was like a frustrated actor. I mean, he could do, you know, every once in a while I got to be somebody's wife, but usually it was him, and because he was so good at it. And we role played with this guy. We did Virginia Satir's family sculpting with this guy. We did every kind of thing, anything that we thought would make a difference. Empathy, we did an empathy, and by the way, I have stuff on my website, which is just alyceleviolet.com. You can download any of it. It's got stuff on assessment and benefits of group, things that, you know, so I thought you could just do that and go to the website. Anyway, we did whatever we could do with him. And we also, at that time, were doing picnics during the summer. It was one of the things that we are not allowed to do now, but we did it for over 20 years. We had one of the men in group who said, Alyce, you only know us in one dimension. You know us, like you only know us here in this room, like an angry guy. But you know, that's not who we are, that's not all of who. I said, well, how would I know those other parts of you? And the guy said, well, we could have dinner. And I said, well, let's talk about how we would do that. Well, we planned a picnic. And it was a potluck, and the men were in charge of bringing the food. And they had the ability to invite their families. And of course it was, they had to feel comfortable enough to invite their families because they knew their wives were going to come up to me, which they did. And so we did a lot of different things that I think were creative. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up right now. And what I would just say to you is that this man who was so violent, we're celebrating his 16th year in group this coming week. And his girlfriend had a stroke. And he came into group and he said, I have to tell you something that I feel very good about. He said, my girlfriend had a stroke, and I'm feeding her, and I'm bathing her, and I'm caring for her, and I never knew I could be that kind of man. Wow. Thank you for your attention.